Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, where we help you manage workplace safety one episode at a time. And now, your very own Safety Pro, Blaine J. Hoffman.
Alrighty, another episode of the Safety Pro Podcast. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. This is one I've been wanting to do for a little while. I don't know, putting it off, call it procrastination or whatever, but I'm finally getting around to covering Walking Working Surfaces Update. So we know that these changes are coming and it's sort of a phased rollout. Certain milestones are built into this update with dates going into the future for things like physical modifications to facilities and training, things like that. So let's just go ahead, get started on aisles and walkways. And, the reason why we're going to start there is because it's so broad, right? I mean, every single work environment has aisles and walkways. I don't care what industry you're in. These are, anytime you provide floor space for employees to walk from point A to point B, that's an aisle or walkway. That's a walking working surface, right? In general. So, and it, it doesn't matter what industry you're in as well. It doesn't matter if you're a heavy manufacturing environment or if you're the ma and pa ice cream shop, you've got aisles and walkways. So, basically the way we want to approach this is we're going to start broad and then we're going to narrow our focus on the update. So aisles and walkways. We know that if they're not maintained properly, they can provide a variety of hazards, slips, trips, falls, or of course, access to other types of hazards, even struck-by hazards, can take place. As far as the regulations go, 1910.22, general requirements for walking working surfaces, and 1910.176, handling of materials, the general section. You're going to find a lot of information in those two regs, 1910.22 and 1910.176. So OSHA defines an aisle or walkway as a designated pathway inside a building or work environment. That's it. If you've designated an area for people to walk, that's an aisle or a walkway. So let's run down a quick summary of the requirements in these changes, these updates, okay? So in general, employers must 1. Mark aisles and walkways. The standard doesn't define how this is to be accomplished. Keep that in mind. It simply says mark aisles and walkways. 2. Keep aisles and walkways free from obstructions, like, sharp or protruding objects, loose boards, even snow and ice, stuff like that, under the employer's control. That's what we're talking about there. 3, provide sufficient safe clearance where mechanical handling equipment is used. What's mechanical handling equipment? Tow motors, forklifts, walk-behinds, pallet jacks, stuff like that. 4, inspect aisles and walkways. This is key, on a regular basis and as necessary. And number 5, correct any hazardous conditions before allowing workers to use the aisles or walkways. Okay, so that was a quick summary of the requirements. Let's get into floor markings. As I mentioned, OSHA doesn't really define how you do this. So, a floor marking is a marking method whereby slip-resistant paint, tape, or other coating media is applied or adhered to, or is integral with the floor in a solid color, angled bars of alternating color, a checkerboard of alternating color, a geometric combination of colors, or photoluminescent application. So in dim light, 3M has a good product for this as well, for the photoluminescent stuff. The color selection of these markings often contrasts with the floor color and may depend on several things. So you can go to 1910.144, or you can use the ANSI safety color code. That's, hold on. I have it here. Hold on. Let me look it up. caught the pro off guard. ANSI here, Z 535.1-1998. I have my trusty cheat sheet here. So that's it right there. You can also go to 535.1-2011, which talks about, it does not offer color definitions, but it does specify the latest safety colors. 1998 offers the safety color definitions, and that gives examples of the hazard or message identified by each color. That's where you're going to find sort of that legend of, okay, what color means what. And the 2011, the ANSI Z 535.1-2011, again, it's going to specify the latest safety colors. There are also other international, U.S., state, local codes that you can refer to, but that's the thing. It just has to be something. I've seen blue, I've seen green on floors, green for walk, stuff like that. Just got to find something that works, as long as you don't create confusion with other hazards that are marked in your facility. Keep that in mind. Floor markings are often used to indicate an area designated as like an egress route, a safety zone, like a pedestrian-only aisleway. Maybe the floor marking is used to indicate a hazard, like a change in elevation, or a stair, or a loading dock edge, stuff like that. You can also use them to indicate restricted areas meant only for authorized employees. Floor markings can also be used to designate or indicate clearance areas, like in front of fire extinguishers, live electrical parts or electrical panels, eye wash stations, things that you can't block. Yeah, you want to keep those areas open. So floor markings are often used in that regard as well. So you can also use them to for the location of a particular type of storage or piece of equipment, work activity. So an example would be an aisle designated for like a power industrial truck or a forklift, traffic only. You could put no pedestrian. You can mark the floor, no pedestrian, stuff like that. So while floor markings are intended to be permanent, the downside with many floor markings is they can deteriorate over time. Just from traffic, especially with industrial traffic like forklifts and things that are turning and skidding and scraping and moving across these markings. So you have to maintain them. So set up a regular or frequent inspection cycle or rhythm based on how heavily trafficked the areas of your facility are. So make sure you select floor marking material that is durable enough that you're not constantly replacing and repairing it, but you do have to set up that rhythm of frequent, regular inspections. So what about areas where it's infeasible or impractical in certain work settings to put down a floor marking? For example, what if there's a lot of dirt on dirt floors, some foundries, continuous concentrations of sand and dust, stuff like that? Other marking methods like pillars, flags, cones, barrels, I've even seen lights that are up above, lasers that hit the floor indicating lines or arrows or things, so that it doesn't matter what's on the floor, you'll always see it. I've seen those alternatives being used. So you have to adjust to the work environment, okay? Those are appropriate alternatives to floor markings if employees are trained to recognize them. You have to make sure that when you put anything on the floor that is giving somebody instruction or guidance, that you also include that in some sort of a orientation for new hires, ongoing reminders for existing employees, like safety toolbox talks or things like, or annual refresher training, things like that. Now, for general industry, permanent aisles and passageways must be appropriately marked according to that 1910-176A, and service, repair, and assembly pits less than 10 feet in depth may use floor markings instead of fall protection according to 1910.28B8. However, here's the catch, however, that does not require marking by colored floor markings only. Painted yellow lines, for example, are usually recognized as the most convenient and inexpensive way to mark aisles and passageways, since the lines normally last several years without maintenance or repainting. Yet various marking methods or devices other than colored floor markings may be appropriate for indicating permanent aisles and passageways, as I mentioned earlier, more like physical barriers. They're popular, right? But floor markings are not required by federal OSHA to mark the floor in front of fire extinguishers, eye wash stations, or live electrical parts. Again, they're popular. I see them all the time, and it is a great best practice. So I always tell my friends in the consulting world, be careful when you say, hey, I'm going to, do a site audit for a client, and I'm going to write up, you didn't mark the floor in front of an electrical panel. Make sure you're writing that up as a recommended best practice, not as a regulatory citation. You're not citing any reg for this because it doesn't exist. Again, talking about OSHA. They're not required by federal OSHA to mark the edges of stairs, platforms, or loading docks either. However, again, using floor markings for these situations can help ensure safety. It is a best practice. And if you're going to mark aisles in one area and hazards in one area covered by the standard, but then not mark others, you can create some confusion among workers, and you can even create a training issue where they get confused by saying, well, wait a minute, if it's not required, then why are we maintaining it over here? And they stop reporting when they've become damaged or worn. We don't notice them anymore. So I'm always in favor of going above and beyond, but let's stick with what OSHA requires at a minimum here and make sure that I'm not sending you, the listeners, a mixed message. It's clear that it's important for us to understand that the floor markings are very specific and don't cover everything. So it's also frustrating, especially as a safety professional, to have to look at somebody and say, yeah, you have to mark that, but not this other thing over here. When this other thing over here clearly, poses more risk, like blocking a fire extinguisher. Fire extinguishers have to be maintained. You have to maintain clearance. Now, your local fire codes are going to be more strict than OSHA, but as far as OSHA goes, they just say, hey, as long as you don't have to, move something or climb on something to get the fire extinguisher, it's considered accessible. So, OSHA doesn't go far enough in that aspect. So, more marking requirements. So let's go beyond aisles and walkways. The following regulations do have marking requirements. 1910.28, fall protection and falling object protection. 1910.35, alternate exit routes. In 1910.144, safety color code for marking physical hazards. So physical hazards have to be marked, and there's a certain color for that. In 1910.176, handling materials. Again, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. You have to check your state or local fire and building codes to see if any other floor marking requirements are specified. For example, the NFPA Life Safety Code, the 2009 and later editions call for the marking of the top and bottom stair on their tread nosing, with safety yellow, where the riser is inconsistent with other risers in the flight by over 3/8 of an inch, I believe is what it is. Some stairs, what'll happen is, in older buildings especially, and some newer ones, you maintain a certain consistency with the flight of stairs. You may have to make an adjustment on the first and the last one to get everything else even. It balances out. But if there's a difference of 3/8 or more inch in the rise, you have to mark that. But that's not OSHA. So you got to check your local codes as well. So again, let's summarize this. You've got to mark permanent aisles and passageways. That's 1910.176A. You have to identify areas around repair, service, and assembly pits less than 10 feet. And that's in accordance with 1910.28B8. You can do this by applying floor markings, and that they have to be at least 6 feet from the edge of the pit in colors that contrast with the surrounding areas, or place warning lines at least 6 feet from the edge of the pit. And then, of course, lastly, check your local state and local fire and building codes. It's also important to note the following. Floor markings are not required by federal OSHA to mark the floor in front of fire extinguishers, eyewash stations, or live electrical parts, the edges of stairs, platforms, or loading docks, or exits or ways of exit access. And floor markings would not meet the exit sign requirements anyway. Floor markings can be used in addition to, the required exit signs, but floor markings could not be the sole way of marking a fire exit. So keep that in mind. Let's move on. Housekeeping regulations. These regs, they lay out the requirements to perform housekeeping duties. And in some cases, the regulations specify, how to perform these duties or other associated information. In addition, particular employers have more stringent or I guess you could say slightly different housekeeping procedures or functions to fulfill. The requirements for housekeeping apply to all general industry employers. Again, there are some specific requirements that pertain to bloodborne pathogen and toxic and hazardous substances, and that's where you get into these different employers, right? So here are the regs that you can refer to on this one. 1910.22, general requirements for walking working surfaces. 1910.141, sanitation. And 1910.176, again, as in before, materials handling. So here's a summary of the requirements here. Keep all areas clean and orderly and in a sanitary condition. Utilize housekeeping practices to reduce or eliminate the risk of combustible dust explosions. Keep floors clean and dry. Where wet processes are used, maintain drainage and use like false floors, platforms, mats, or other dry standing places where practicable. Keep floors free from protruding nails, splinters, holes, or loose boards. Also, keep aisles and passageways clear and in good repair with no obstruction across or in aisles that could create a hazard. Keep storage areas free from accumulation of materials that would constitute hazards from tripping, fire, explosion, or pest harborage. Ensure employees keep food and drinks only in designated storage areas away from toilet facilities and toxic materials. And when necessary, exercise vegetation control. So that's just a quick rundown on housekeeping and aisles and walkways under the new changes coming to the walking working surfaces rule. There are more updates on ladders, stairways, dock boards, even designated areas for fall protection. I'm going to have a whole separate podcast on that one, but I wanted to give you a quick rundown on the walking working surfaces rule and starting with aisles and walkways and general housekeeping. So I hope you found this informative. Please let me know if I missed something, if you would like to hear another topic on the podcast, or if you have a question for me to answer on another episode. I've been stockpiling some questions over the last couple of months from a whole bunch of listeners asking questions. I'm going to do another Q&A podcast episode soon. I like to rack up a bunch of questions for that, sort of a potpourri, if you will, mixed bag of topics. But it's always fun to answer questions from people. I hear from people all the time. So, don't be afraid to reach out and let me know what you think and run something past me. As always, be safe, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Safety Pro Podcast. Be sure to visit www.consulthoffman.com for articles and information about safety services. To have Blaine read your question on the show, email him at customerservice@consulthoffman.com. Be sure to have 2 F's and 2 N's on Hoffman. Until next time, be safe.